Today, American President Donald Trump effectively declared victory in the trade war between the United States of America and China and announced that both countries have agreed on a trade deal. This deal will last for centuries and will be remembered in history. But in fact, Donald Trump essentially failed his own trade war and returned to the starting point, to the moment when he began escalating this trade war. Because his statement that now the United States keeps a 55% tariff while China only has 10% is not true. And in general, Donald Trump's trade deal with China is not what many expected, even Republicans and supporters of the Make America Great Again movement. My name is Alexei Pichi. Today is June 11th. Let's discuss together in this episode what exactly the Americans and the Chinese managed to agree on. And is the new trade deal between the United States and China really the one that the White House was expecting? Let's go through everything step by step. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel. The link is in the description of this video. There we post news as soon as it comes in. So I'll start with the latest updates. Today, Donald Trump announced that the United States and China have agreed on a trade deal. In particular, let me remind you, this is already the third day in a row that negotiations have been taking place between the Chinese and American delegations in London. And in fact, this is a continuation of the negotiations that began a month ago in Geneva. And it seemed that a deal had already been made back then. But no, then there was a scandal and now they've returned to it again. And Trump insists that now this deal must be approved by American leader Donald Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. And as Donald Trump writes, our deal with China is completed and is subject to final approval by President Xi and myself. According to Trump, the deal stipulates that China will supply the United States with magnets and rare earth metals, and in return, the United States will provide China with, quote, what was agreed upon, including the opportunity for Chinese students to study at American colleges and universities. We get a total of 55% of the tariffs, China gets 10%. The relationship is excellent. After Trump officially became the 45th United States president, he imposed tough tariffs against many countries. The tariffs also impacted China, prompting Beijing to retaliate with heavy tariffs against the United States. It got to the point where tariffs were just over 100%, escalation began, then there was a certain thaw, and now we've basically come back to where we started. Well, now let's get to the most interesting part. Why is Donald Trump deceiving all of us by claiming that the United States and China managed to make some kind of mega deal on the trade war? So now I'm going to show you a wonderful infographic that shows the entire dynamic of the negotiations in the trade war between the United States and China, which shows that Trump hasn't achieved anything new. So Trump said that right now the tariff score is like this. The United States has 55% on Chinese goods and China has 10% on American goods. And here's an infographic from a month ago, but miracle of miracles, it's still relevant today, even after the supposed signing of some mega deal in London. So how was the tariff structure formed in the first place? At the end of February and the beginning of March, the United States imposes a 20% duty on fentanyl and keeps the basic tariff at 10%. We get 30%. China responds, but not with a single tariff like Donald Trump did, instead with sectoral tariffs. That is, China starts to strike selectively. So, for some things there's a 10% tariff, for others 15%, and for some 34%. And some things were actually completely banned for the Chinese to buy from Americans. So, in fact, some goods were completely banned from being imported. The biggest blow is the ban on importing Chinese rare earth metals. That's what made Trump panic and call Xi Jinping last week, asking to return to negotiations after all. Because without these rare earth metals, the United States of America can't manage. And as is well known, China is a monopolist in this market, processing and extracting 90% of the world's rare earth metals and magnets. But, as they say, if you don't look into all this, it seems like China is only introducing a 10% basic tariff and everything else remains behind the scenes. In April, the tariff war flared up, as you recall. As a result, the United States imposes a 145% tariff against China. China imposes a 125% and 25% tariff against the United States. Then there is a de-escalation. Both sides drop 115% of the tariffs. And then we end up with a situation where the United States keeps tariffs at 30% and China at 10%. However, that's not considering China's targeted measures once again. This happened more than a month ago. We ended up in a situation where it's 3010, but where did that come from? Donald Trump added another 25% and claimed that the United States is leaving 55% against China, while supposedly only 10% went to China. In reality, it's all very simple. Trump, just as I expected, is presenting an empty deal as a big victory. The thing is, Trump simply took the 30% and added the 25% tariffs that were introduced during his first presidential term. So these 25% have already been in effect for many years as a result of Trump's deal, which he announced today. These are the same 30% against the 10% base tariffs that were in place just a month ago and were agreed upon back in Geneva. And besides, China still kept a number of sectoral restrictions, but it's inappropriate for Trump to talk about that. And now the main question arises, what was the point of this whole trade war if the countries are basically just going back to where they started? Roughly speaking, Donald Trump is now claiming that the main achievement is that China has unfrozen the supply of rare earth metals to the United States of America. So, before all these tariffs were introduced, China was already supplying these rare earth metals, and basically the ban on importing rare earth metals to the United States was a response to what Donald Trump had implemented. But of course, this part is overlooked by the White House team, and they say, look, we've reached an agreement and now China is resuming the supply of rare earth metals to us. And all of this is presented as just a huge victory. So after such a fierce war of words which escalated into mutual restrictions on key export goods, American and Chinese officials met in London this week to find a way to agree on what they essentially settled in Geneva a month ago. White House reports that the chief trade negotiators of the nations have seemingly accomplished this objective. And on Tuesday evening, both Chinese and Trump administration officials announced that they had agreed on a framework for implementing the consensus they reached back at the beginning of May. And the trade truce will be sent to their leaders for approval. Here are the businesses, consumers, and investors from Wall Street. And undoubtedly, they'll breathe a sigh of relief because of all these burdensome tariffs. They have caused significant concern. The easing of trade barriers between the two largest economies in the world should lower costs and help bring much needed certainty to an economy that is showing some signs. Still, there is tension. And against this backdrop, Trump announces that, look, we've reached an agreement. Without a doubt, any agreement, even a trade agreement like this, was extremely necessary. After Trump's statements about the so-called Liberation Day on April 2nd, tensions reached such a level that trade between the United States and China practically came to a halt. Because any tariff over 100% is in fact an embargo on all supplies. United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the chief negotiator for America at the trade talks with China, stated that the previous tariff levels were unsustainable. Is that so? And on May 12th, delegates from China and the United States announced that they are significantly reducing their historically high tariffs on each other. Economists lowered their recession forecasts, and the dying consumer confidence actually recovered. But Trump and his administration have become increasingly hostile toward China in recent weeks, accusing China of breaking the promises made in mid-May. That is, supposedly China was violating the terms that were agreed upon in Geneva a month ago, and China in turn stated that it was the United States that was not fulfilling its obligations under the Geneva Agreement. Well, there you have it. The Trump administration, of course, expected China to lift restrictions on rare earth metals, which are absolutely essential components for a wide range of electronics. However, China decided there was no need to hurry. And China very slowly, allowed these rare earth metals to return to the open market bit by bit, from where these metals would then end up in the United States of America. Trump was frustrated by the delay, asking why it was taking so long. So, accordingly, he decided, for example, to say, let's just expel all Chinese students from the country. China has an actual monopoly on rare earth metals, without which cars, jet engines, dyes, medicines, and so on cannot be produced. That is, there's a whole huge range. But most importantly, they are used in the defense industry, the space industry, and so on. And accordingly, without Chinese rare earth metals, the United States simply can't manage. Nevertheless, despite the positive trends, the United States and China are still in an economic standoff. And now the Trump administration claims that Chinese companies are more than happy to sell inexpensive products on the United States market. But China imposes significant restrictions on American companies operating in the country and encourages Chinese companies to simply steal American intellectual property. There's nothing new here, but China has long disputed these claims. Trump, during his first presidential term, raised tariffs on China, citing national security concerns. Biden kept these tariffs and even doubled some of them. And basically, the situation remained exactly the same as it was during Trump's first presidential term. But the second Trump administration decided, as I already mentioned, to raise these tariffs. And by the time we got to Geneva, we had reached a figure of 30% plus. These are the 30% that had already been agreed upon back in Geneva. In addition, the White House canceled the so-called exemption that allowed parcels worth less than $800 to be imported into the United States without paying duties even after the trade deal was concluded. Complex tariffs create significant trade barriers with America's second largest trading partner, raising prices for American businesses and consumers without easy solutions or clear market alternatives. And some giant companies, for example, have complex supply chains that can only withstand part of the price pressure. But even Apple, which announced it would supply most American iPhones from India, that is, to the American market, as Chinese tariffs rise, said it would still face a quarterly increase in costs of $900 million. It is precisely because of these tariffs that other companies such as these have been completely withdrawn from the Chinese market. And even without any tariffs or other formal barriers from China on the purchase of American airplanes. But it has hardly made any sales in China since 2019. And this market used to be the largest in the world for airplane purchases. And so, when the first round of tariffs was introduced by Trump during his first presidency, after that the Chinese simply refused to buy Boeings. Of course, Trump doesn't really talk about this, but nevertheless he insists that everything is fine even today, posting about it on social media. He posted the following on Truth Social. President Xi and I will work closely together to open China to American trade. This will be a great victory for both countries. A trade truce might be the best alternative if it lasts longer this time than it did after April. But if the deal leads to lower trade barriers, it could stimulate both economies. Nevertheless, this whole trade war has already dealt certain blows to both the Chinese and American economies. And the main takeaway from this episode is that Trump basically spent 4 months butting heads with the Chinese, but in the end he rolled everything back to where it all started. And let me remind you, it all started when he imposed tariffs to fight fentanyl and a 10% base tariff that he introduced against basically every country in the world. And in fact, after almost 4 months of back and forth and trying to prove something, he ended up right back where he started. And now he's presenting China's agreement to supply rare earth metals to the United States as his only victory. Let me remind you once again, China banned their export in response to the trade war started by the American president. That's the whole mega deal of Donald Trump. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like.